vakar iš tikrųjų Discord'e ginčiaus gal valandą su čivaku. Kaip jis ten parašė, aš dabar nepamenu, kaip parašė. Kažkaip užsiminėm apie BlackRock'ą. Net nežinau, apie ką mes kalbėjom, kai užsiminė apie BlackRock'ą. Ir mes ten ilgai susirašinėjom. Aš scrollinu, to rasiu tiksliai. Ar tikrai to rasiu? Anyway, žodžiu. Ir kad maždaug parašė, aš prisikabinau prie žodžio, kaip sakant. Kaip visą laiką prisikabinau prie žodžio, nes žodžiai yra svarbu ir jos naudoti teisingai. Nes BlackRock'as yra, Vanguardas BlackRock'as yra naudojama visų dabar tų sąmokslininkų ir panašiai kaip bugimenas. Kaip gazdinimo, tas toks, kaip čia, kuo galima gazdinti. Gal jis reaktą kažkokį žiūrėjo ir patagino kažką, nesvarbu ten, bet žodžiu. Bet tada, ir aš tą labai dažnai matau. Aš matau ten ir iš tų visų red pillerių ypatingai, ten iš tų visokių, kur pas Joe Roganą tas vienas debiliukas buvo nuėjęs ir ten pasakoja, BlackRock'as kontroliuoja visą pasaulį. Tiesiog, aš tuo metu pasidomėjau, ten akimirkai nieko nekontroliuoja. Taip, vapšė, ne taip vyksta dalykai. Bet, vėlgi, aš ekonomikai smarkiai nenusimanau, žinai, aš nenusimanau smarkiai, tiesiog pažiūrėjau, kad nesąmonė ir viskas. Tai dabar, kai pamačiau žmogus rašo ir jis ten parašė 7% Disney valdo dabar BlackRock'as. Ir aš jam parašiau vėlgi, nevaldo BlackRock'as nieko. Ir prasidėjo diskusija gal valandą užtrukus, kur aš tiesiog mėginau pademonstruoti, kad tam, kad mes vartotumėm žodį valdo, mes suteikiam gan daug kontrolės. Kai žodis valdau reiškia, kad tu gali sprendimus priimti, kad tu, tai jie nevaldo. Tai iš karto 7% turi, jie nevaldo. Jie net nevaldo, aš nežinau, ar galima sakyti, kad jie valdo 7%, techniškai tie žmonės, investitoriai valdo, bet anyway. Tai ir mes ten kalbėjom, šnekėjom, tai prie ko priėm daugmaž prie tokios tarsi, kaip aš supratau bent jau. Esmė maždaug tokia. Tai BlackRock'as yra, kaip fondas įsivaizduokim, kur investuoja žmonių pinigus. Dabar žmonių pinigai, tai Amerikoje ten yra 401k, yra tas jų pensijos kažkokie ten fondai, kur visi jos turi. Ir ten visi praškai jos turi. Tai BlackRock'as kaip tas fondas, jie paima tas ir tada investuoja tos pinigus, tarkim, kažkur. Dabar kur jie investuoja, į visur. Į kitus ten fondus, man atrodo, į indeksus, aš nežinau, ten visur tipo kažkaip. Ir taip gauna, žinai, kad jie kontroliuoja žmonės, žinai, absurdiškai didelius pinigus. Bet tie pinigai nėra jų, tai yra, žmonių pinigai, tipo. Ir pro juos tiesiog, investuoja. Bet kai tu pasižiūri, tipo, sąrašuose, kam priklauso Apple, žinai, BlackRock ten 12%, ar ten 10%, ar 7%, Disney, žinai. Ir tada atsiranda konspiracijos teorijos, žiūrėk, BlackRock'as, tada Vanguardas ir dar kažkoks ten yra trečias, Deep kažkoks ten. Ir, juos sudėdi, jie kontroliuoja visą pasaulį, didžiausias įmonės, ir sąmokslo teorijos bilinas pačias. Tai dabar tas žodis, jie valdo, jie nevaldo nieko. Paskui mes priėmėm prie tos diskusijos, ką iš tikro žmogus galbūt norėjo sakyti ir panašiai, kaip supratau, tai kad jie turi įtakos. Ką jie tikrai turi? Jie įtakos aišku turi. Ir galima ginčyti, kad gal jie netgi per daug įtakos turi, negu ką mes norėtume ar panašiai. Bet čia yra visiškai kitoks teiginys, negu kad jie valdo. Dabar, kai jie turi įtakos ir jie už savo interesus kovoja, žinoma, niekas nesginčys su to. Tame nieko blogo nėra. Visi shareholderiai už savo... Jeigu įmoniai turės 10 žmonių po 10%, visi kovos už savo interesus, už savo... ir jie turi įtakos. Bet jie nieko nevaldo, žodžiu. Tai dabar tokia situacija atsiduri, kur jeigu BlackRock'as, pavyzdžiui, turi, nežinau, 10% ir jie tada turi tą balsą kažkokį įmonį. Ir jie prabalsuoja ir priema sprendimą kažkokį vienaip ar kitaip, kur priema sprendimą jiems, tai sąmokslininkai gali sakyti, mato, tie kontroliuoja. Bet tai kiti reiškia irgi balsavo už tą patį, tai ne tik BlackRock'as buvo suinteresuotas, galbūt tiesiog buvo geras sprendimas. Nežinau, žodžiu, aš prisikabinau prie to žodžio, nes nieko nevaldo. Bet aš iš tikrųjų nelabai daug ką žinau, kaip tai veikia. Aš mažai ką žinau. Aš žinau tik vieną, kad mes negalim teikti valdo, kontroliuoja, tiesiog mėtytis ir sąmokslo teorijos apeliuoti kažkokias. Ir maždaug seniai, tai, aišku, jie kontroliuoja, tiek pinigų, tiek įtakos turi, tai aišku, jie piktavališkai daro. Tada sakyčiau labai konkrečiai, kur? Kokie įvykiai buvo, paskaitom apie juos, kažkur naujienas, nes greičiausiai bus. Greičiausiai per kiek jie egzistuoja turbūt dešimtmečiais. Greičiausiai tikrai bus situacijų, kur kažkur galbūt overstepino, kažkur galbūt mėgino sužaisti kažkaip ne visai švariai. Aišku, tokių bus ir kiekvieną kartą ten ir sustiprinamas apsaugos ten būna ir tada baudos išrašytos. Prisimenu, tikrai yra buvę ten, kurie ar su defense kontraktais, ar su kažkuo kažką mėgino ten žaisti. Tai aišku bus. Bet, kad pademonstruotum, kai jie valdo pasaulį ir kažką čia turėtum ne tik pavienius įvykius surasti, o tada sistematiškai kažkaip, bet jo, to nieko nėra, to tiesiog nieko nėra. Visi tie red pilleriai, visi tie sąmokslininkai bandė tą atkasti ir to tiesiog nieko nėra. Tai kaip būtų, aš radau video, kuris vienas populiariausių apie tai buvo. Pirmą minutę pažiūrėjau ir galvoju, pažiūrėsiu ant Steam. Čia pažiūrėjau toks, kaip suprantu, visai neblogas kanalas, permečiau akim, aš nežinau to čivako visko, bet aš čia tam, kad išklausyti, žinai, argumentus vis tiek. Tai gal paaiškins ir biškai visus edukuos, kaip iš tikrųjų tas BlackRockas veikia ir kas tas yra ir ar iš tikrųjų valdo pasaulį ir iš tikrųjų turi absurdiškai daug įtakos, kad tiesiog manipuliuoja rinkas ir pro tas manipulacijas šitaip valdo viską, kas tiesiog netaip veikia, bet okei.
Bagel, I'm your host Richard Coffin. If videos online are to be believed, the beautiful, free capitalist system that is the stock market, which allows individuals to buy and own shares of companies, has a pretty nefarious secret about it that might shock you. The largest corporations in the US and possibly the world are actually being controlled by two secret puppet masters, BlackRock and Vanguard. And State Street to a smaller extent. You see, if you take any given stock and you look up the top shareholder for that company, you're likely to see one of three names, BlackRock, Vanguard, or State Street. And this isn't just anecdotal, because according to a 2017 Cambridge University report, these three companies are actually the top shareholder in 88% of the S&P 500, which might sound impossible, but BlackRock and Vanguard together, the larger of the three, collectively manage $17 trillion in assets, which represents
Amerikos biudžeto pusę,
entire US stock market capitalization. Now, that money is invested in other assets as well as stocks, so they don't actually own a third of the US stock market, but it just goes to highlight it's a lot of money. And naturally, this has led a lot of people online to start warning the masses. One lady sought to spread the message through the medium of dance, warning that these two companies had gobbled up much of corporate America. Vivek Ramaswamy, the presidential candidate, has called this group, quote, arguably the most powerful cartel in human history, but more important than a TikToker or presidential candidate raising the alarm.
Todėl aš ir nekenčiu, kai žmonės parašo, jog valdo, kontroliuoja ir panašiai, nes visi tie psichai tos pačius žodžius mėtus, jog kartelis, ten mafija, žinai, kontroliuoja. Ne tą tie žodžiai reiškia ir, tipo, mes, jeigu norim normaliai šnekėtum, tam reikia normaliai žodžius vartoti, nes tada arba būsim kaip gaižūnas, kaip ten gaižūnas. Jo, gaižūnas, kur tiesiog nesvarbu kokius žodžius, kaip vartoja ir, tipo, tiesiog baugina visus ir man nepatinka tokie dalykai.
Is the fact that it showed up on the Joe Rogan podcast.
The guy running BlackRock.
Va, šitas. BPD, PSD, kažkokios 3 raidės jisai. Aš mačiau iš Destiny net daugiau jo laidų. Jisai pas Joe Rogan ir buvo, jo, kur ten kledėjo Jesus ir tada jis per savo laidą kledėjo. Ištisai ir tada aš kai jį pamačiau, tada aš pasidomėjau ten kažkada senai ir paskaičiau biškuką. Kas čia toks yra? Kaip jis vadinas? BPD, čia nerašo, Joe Rogan. BPD tai borderline personality disorder, bet ne šitaip reiškia. BlackRock. Patrick Bet David, PBD. PBD čia yra. Taip trumpinys. Jie taip trumpina, bet čia yra Patrick Bet David. Yeah. Va iš karto ir Joe Rogano klipą metą.
The Joe Rogan experience.
How much?
Jo, iš karto yra klipas, kur, I guess, jo, jis klėdės čia. But anyway, čia žiūrim šitą.
President of the United States, if we look at the kind of influence he's got in every industry, Joe.
Now, large corporations running America, not really shocking news, but what people are particularly concerned about is the fact that Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock specifically, appears to have some sinister intentions behind the place of power he finds himself in, which is that recently he's been using this authority to push ESG, environmental, social, and governance factors that aim to incorporate sustainability into investing.
Environmental, social, and governance, čia būtent apie tą ESG ir kalbėjo, palauk, kaip čia išsireiškia, tas PBD apie tai kalbėjo.
Which is that recently he's been using this authority to push ESG, environmental, social, and governance factors that aim to incorporate sustainability into investing. I know, terrifying development, but stay with me, we can get through this. Joking aside though, ESG has become a pretty controversial topic, not necessarily because people are inherently against greener operations or sustainability, but more so about how it's implemented. With some people raising concerns about greenwashing, which is pretending that you have greener operations than you actually do, and what standards are actually used to rate a company based on its ESG variables, since there's no uniform standard here, and ESG to one company can be defined differently than ESG at another. But BlackRock has more or less taken up the mantle in the space, and the CEO, Larry Fink, has pretty openly discussed his intent to explicitly pressure companies to report and adopt different ESG initiatives.
If you don't achieve these levels of impact, your compensation could be impacted, okay? You have to force behaviors.
And regardless of whether you support...
Čia už ko kabinasi turbūt žmonės, kai sako, jie valdo, kontroliuoja. Nu, bet čia viskas yra, kaip aš suprantu, gal čia apie tai kalbės, viskas yra, jie turi įtakos, aišku, ir jie gali kažkiek tos įtakos rodyti, bet jie nieko nekontroliuoja. Jie sako, kaip ir bet kokia partija, kaip bet kokia, kažkokia grupė su interesais, aišku, tu savo tą influencą, savo tą įtaką mėginsi pasiekti rezultatą, kokiu tu nori. Tai nieko iš esmės su to blogo nėra, bet tai nereiškia, kad tu kontroliuoji, nes tai reiškia, kad tu nusprendai ir padarai. Ką tu nusprendai, tą ir literally priverti padaryti, tu priėmei sprendimą, bet jie nepriminėja sprendimų jokių, jie turi tik balsą, tame yra esmė. Tada aišku tas argumentas, kad jie tiek daug visko, jie tiek daug visur turi įtakos, kad jie gali sukoordinuoti visą, čia jau sąmokslo teorija, tu turi pateikti kažkokius įrodymus, o va tam įrodymų ir nėra. To grand collusiono ir panašiai, tam įrodymų ir nėra jokių.
ESG or not, you could see why a lot of people find this shocking that a single corporation would have this much influence, and why it's caused a lot of people to really rally against these companies. But some believe in BlackRock explicitly uses its size and influence over ESG to manage competition, pull the strings of politicians, and ultimately control everything from the news that we consume to the food that we eat. And with Larry Fink being involved with a number of international institutions, such as the World Economic Forum, and BlackRock having been tapped by the government during past crises, you can see how easy it is to form world domination theories around these groups. But I want to talk about these companies today and the relationships they have with publicly traded stocks, not really to defend them or even defend their size, but rather to highlight that most of the claims you see circulating online about BlackRock and Vanguard and their unfettered influence over the stock market are at best exaggerated and at worst complete misunderstandings of how these companies function and even how share ownership works. That's not to say they don't have influence. A lot of people highlight how ExxonMobil saw 3 new ESG-focused directors elected to their board, in part thanks to BlackRock's support. But in this video, I'll try to lay out all the details and the nuance of the situation so you understand the power that they have, but also the power that they don't have that a lot of people claim they do. And you might know that I recently put out a short on this exact topic, but it really wasn't up to par with the nuance that I try to strike with my videos. So I'll be taking my time on this one to provide a more neutral, hopefully, perspective on things. Let's start with the easiest claim to tackle here, which is that BlackRock and Vanguard basically own everything. Obviously, as the largest shareholder in all these companies, that might lead you to believe that somehow these companies have managed to gobble up a colossal chunk of the stock market for their own benefit. And this is indeed a popular claim that circulates on social media, largely by people who are outside the finance industry. But the belief that these two institutions own everything really just stems from a misunderstanding of what these companies are. Because at $17 trillion in assets under management isn't their money. These companies are asset managers, meaning they take client money and help invest it, taking care of all the research and administration that comes with that. BlackRock, for example, manages $10 trillion in what's called assets under management, the assets they manage. But they themselves only own, in BlackRock's case, $123 billion in total assets, which is the amount you'll find on their financial statements. The $10 trillion is actually client money from millions of investors, including other companies, pensions, YOLOers on the Robinhood app who have put their funds into one of BlackRock's mutual or exchange-traded funds or other solutions. But while that money is invested through a BlackRock fund, it is not BlackRock's money. They just facilitate the investment and indeed do hold the shares in custody, which is why they show up as a top shareholder, but they aren't the ultimate owners of those shares. You could compare it to how a bank takes deposits from clients, but even there, banks actually do treat client deposits as money of their own, and so long as they keep certain metrics in check, they can treat it as their own funds for funding operations and making loans, whereas these asset managers actually face stricter requirements in terms of what this money can and cannot be used for, with the investors, again, ultimately being the owners. So right away, hopefully that addresses the more uninformed claims about the situation. These companies haven't managed to gobble up a bunch of the world's assets. The shares effectively belong to their millions of clients. But to be fair, that's not what everyone who's critical of these companies is claiming. People like Patrick Bet-David aren't claiming that these companies own everything, but rather that they control them. As asset managers, Vanguard and BlackRock determine how client money is invested, and you might expect that gives them a lot of power. For example,
čia tas argumentas, kad jie kontroliuoja ne tai, kad jie tiesiog turi pinigų, nes šiandien jų pinigai, bet jie turi balsą. Ir dabar tas balsas, taip jie kontroliuoja viską, kas net nėra logiška. Okay, tu gali sakyti jo, kad įtakos jie daug turi, bet čia jau reikia pateikti įrodymus, kad tu, jeigu teiktum, kad jie tada tą savo 10% ar steiką kažkokį kolaboruoja su kitais ir tada šitai priema sprendimus ten overrulindami kitus, vos nežinai, bet tam nėra jokių įrodymų ir ar gali iš vis taip daryti? Kiek žmonių priema balso sprendimą tada? Pavyzdžiui, tu turi ten, tarkim, įmonė ir 10% turi vieną balsą. Kaip BlackRockas tą balsą duoda? Ar kažkokie bordas ten yra iš kažkokių žmonių? Ar, kaip čia? Ar išrenka į bordą, ar tiesiog bordo direktorius, ar ten vienas žmogus, kuris tiesiog priema sprendimą, to fondo vardu, kaip balsuoti, kaip tas veikia.
Everything has talked about having private meetings with directors for companies, and a lot of people assume that in walking into a boardroom, he will tell directors what he wants them to do, and if they refuse, he can threaten to offload their position, which in many cases would be a massive hit to the company's stock. But the idea that these companies can threaten institutions with the offloading of their giant positions to get what they want is, again, really unfounded for one key reason, which is that the majority of money managed by BlackRock and Vanguard is indexed, meaning they don't really control where it gets invested. Of BlackRock...
Tai jie dar mažiau įtakos turi, jie net įtakos turi daug mažiau negu aš galvočiau. Jeigu tu gali pasakyti, kad žiūrėk, arba jūs dabar visi, žinai, kas turit balso teisę, nubalsuojate ir priema šitą, arba mes atsimsim savo, ten tarsi 10%. Bet jie negali to padaryti. Jie net tokios įtakos neturi. Nes kaip jis pasakė, indeksuojama, ir tu indeksą kokį ten investuoji, kuris tada investuoja į skirtingus, net negali pasitraukti iš tos įmonės. Tai iš vis daug mažiau įtakos tada turi.
$9.4 trillion in assets under management, 6.2 trillion, or 66%, is passively managed via index funds and ETFs, with the vast majority of equity AUM being indexed. Meanwhile, of Vanguard's $7.2 trillion, 79.1% is indexed. What this means is that the vast majority of this money is simply copying an index. So BlackRock can't...
AUM, kaip ten under management... pinigai, kurios managina. Ką ta reiškia? Assets under management, atrodo šitaip. Jo.
Really, on a discretionary basis, sell and buy stocks. If Larry Fink doesn't like what Apple is doing, too bad. Their biggest fund is the S&P 500 fund, and Apple is the largest constituent of that index at around 7%. So they have to hold a sizable Apple position. That fund is legally obligated to stick to its mandate and maintain an investment in the index. Now you might say...
Dar yra taigi jo, kaip čia pasakė, jie yra atsakingi per serialus, matydavau per šitą, kaip tas serialas vadinasi? Silicon Valley buvo, kurie ten tipo įmonės maždaug vieni kitiem suka, jie turi finansinę atsakomybę dargi, plus savo tiem žmonėm kažkaip, kad jie negali priimti sprendimų, kurie būtų minusiniai tam, kad kontroliuotų kažkokią savo agendą. jie actually turi finansinę atsakomybę, kad jie priiminėtų sprendimus, kuriuos gali pateisinti, kad jie, tipo, nu, pliusiniai bus, tipo. Tai jie net nelabai gali random nesąmonės daryti, kad, nu... Ar jie iš vis kažkokios įtakos, apšė čia turi, to paaiškės, kai apšė nieko net negali daryti, aš nežinau. Fiduciary responsibility, atrodo, taip vadina? Fiduciary. Bent jau serialė taip, aš, blet, savo žinias iš serialo gaunu zaibis, bent jau liktais taip tarė.
Then they still get that leverage. Sure, but the vast majority of their funds track external indices that they don't have any control over. So you can see that for the vast majority of this money, there's really no threat of them offloading the shares because, again, they don't really control where the money is invested. In fact, indexing is really the only reason these companies have gotten so big in the first place. People have bought BlackRock and Vanguard funds because they passively track external broad-based indices. John Bogle, the guy who created Vanguard, more or less invented the index fund, which has been a huge benefit to investors, providing market exposure with very minimal fees. So yes, BlackRock and Vanguard could threaten companies with their active footprint, but again, at least on the equity side, that's a very small share of their overall AUM. It doesn't put them in a position to really hold that above the directors' heads. That being said, even with BlackRock and Vanguard not technically owning these shares, even with them not technically being able to determine where a lot of this money gets invested, they do still have a lot of influence. And this is really the part that I wanted to expand on, given that I wasn't able to do so with the short. And that all comes down to the voting rights of these shares.
Okay,
probably know by now, shareholders are the effective owners of a company. But because publicly traded stocks can have millions of individual investors, the way that the shareholders control the company and what it should do is typically by voting on key corporate events. Things like whether a company should accept a merger or acquisition, and even things like management compensation. Shareholders also vote to elect the board of directors, which is a body that looks to keep management under check and represent shareholders at the corporate governance. However, when you invest into a fund, your voting rights are typically forfeited to the fund manager. So even though those assets under management isn't their money, they do get to vote with the rights of those shares as if it were. And as mentioned, this does give the company's influence. Again, with ExxonMobil, we saw three
Tai jo, realiai, aš viską, ką aš vakar sakiau, buvau teisus, gal ne 100%, nes nežinau smulkių dalykų, bet iš esmės viską, ką sakiau, teisingai ir mąsčiau. Kad jo, realiai, vienintelė ta įtaka, kur lieka, tai pro balsus, bet jie nieko nekontroliuoja, tiesiog turi balsą. Ir jo, kai kur gal didelį balsą, rinkos daug dalių turi balsą, bet jie tik balsą tą turi ir kiti balsai yra lygiai tokie patys ir daugiau jų reikia, nu, arba, kaip čia, sukoordinuoti, kas jau būtų visiškai globali konspiracija tarp masyvių interesų grupių ir, nu, tam įrodymų apšė nėra, čia visiškai sąmokslo teorija.
Activist hedge fund engine number one, elected in 2021 thanks largely to BlackRock's support, which was able to swing the vote.
Net jeigu tu būtum koks nors ten Vanguardas, ar aš nežinau, nu tipo konkurentas BlackRockui, ir BlackRockas kažkaip norėtų su tavim kolūdinti, kad sukontroliuotumėt rinką. Tiesiog paskundi teisėsaugai, BlackRock arba uždaro, arba vapšė, nes jie nusikaltėliai, ir tada tau pareina rinka į tavo fondą visą tą, nu, tipo, čia net nebūtų didelio tolko iš vis kolūdinti šitaip. Tai čia jie turi tik tą balsą. Tik balsą ir, nu, tipo, kažkiek tos įtakos tokios, kas vietom, I guess, gali daug gal padaryti, nežinau, but I don't know.
And with Larry Fink being very open to company CEOs in his letters, demanding that they increase climate reporting and consider other stakeholders with their operations, you could see how this raises concerns for an abuse of power. Having this level of centralization can be a problem. And you might think, Richard,
agreed.
Here's our irrefutable proof that these companies do in fact control the world. Larry Fink is in fact going to boardrooms, telling them what to do, and they're going to listen to whatever he wants. Well, no. Again, really not trying to downplay the real issues that could exist here, but there are, again, some very key caveats that no one really covers when describing these institutions as being these sort of puppet masters behind the scenes. The biggest one being that it's still a minority vote. Even if these companies wanted to have complete control over what these shares in what these companies did, they simply don't have that level of power. With ExxonMobil, for example, BlackRock only owned 6.7% of the share float. And the only reason those directors, which at the end of the day only made up 3 of the 12 seats on the board of directors, the only reason they got elected is because they also had other shareholder support, which makes sense because over a 10-year period, the stock actually had a negative price return of 30%. So it's not shocking that investors brought in external directors in hopes of shaking things up. And for most of these positions, the companies have less than a 10% stake, especially when it comes to the larger companies, which is still influential, but does leave another 90+% of voting rights out there for other investors. Not to mention that while these asset managers 90+% of voting rights
holdings daug aš nesuprantu kas čia yra.
Out there for other investors. Not to mention that while these asset managers might be active on the voting side, they really don't want to be activist investors where you go and try to, say, revolutionize how a company is run. It's quite a labor-intensive operation, and really for their size and business model, it wouldn't really be all that feasible. And perhaps the easiest demonstration of the power that these companies don't have in terms of being master puppeteers is the number of times that they didn't get what they want, that they voted against something and still saw the resolution go through. That's of course not to say that their vote doesn't matter, but to be a stickler, it's a very different picture than what a lot of people describe in terms of BlackRock really pulling the strings. It's one thing to say these companies have influence, which is something I would agree with. It's another to say that they're so ingrained in operations and controlling what management does that they have this mastermind level.
Ką aš čia vakar ir mėginau įrodyti, kad jo, nieks nesiginčia, kad turi influence, bet not even close, kad turėtum teikti, kad jie valdo ar kontroliuoja.
Control over 88% of the S&P 500. Secondly, on top of these companies already having a minority vote, the companies have actually recently started passing along their votes to their underlying fund holders. BlackRock last year announced what it calls its voting choice program, where nearly half of the company's indexed equity voting rights
Tai jie netgi dabar kažkaip padarė, kad tu galėtum, būdamas ta maža dalis, nu, tipo, ne kažkas viršų už tai balsuoja, bet kažkokį polinimą daro, nu, tipo, ir kad atitiktų, tai čia dar geriau, bet čia šitą labai būtų sunku padaryti, ne? Jesus, kokia sistema čia turi būti, nes kiek ten šimtai milijonų ten tų skirtingų individualių žmonių turėtų būti.
Will be available for pass-through votes to its unit holders, with Vanguard similarly piloting a program called proxy voting choice. And to be fair, this probably is in response to the policymakers who have been challenging them about the authority they have. But it nonetheless takes what might be, say, an 8% equity stake and really shrinks their voting control further. And finally, it's very clear how a problem could arise from, again, the centralization of power. These companies are ultimately still answerable to their investors. A lot of people worry about BlackRock pursuing a woke agenda and pushing ESG variables at the expense of their investors' return. But these companies still have a fiduciary duty to clients, meaning there is legal responsibility.
Aš sakiau, fiduciary responsibility, jos realiai. Nu, bet jo, tas, atsakingi prieš savo investitorius. Jie turi finansiškai turi priimti sprendimus, kurios gali paaiškinti, kodėl juos priėmė, kai jie atneštų naudą. Tai tu labai limituotai, kokius tu gali sprendimus daryti. Nes jeigu tu priimsi sprendimus, kurie neneša pliusą arba ten nuostolį padaro, tai tu tik pažeidai tą atsakomybę, tą finansinę. Tipo, sakau, nėra net kur turėti tiek daug kontrolės pasaulinės. Čia jis žiauriai gerai pasakoja, by the way, žiauriai gerai dėsto nuosekliai.
Ability to act in the interest of their underlying shareholders. This is doubly so for Vanguard, who itself is actually
Čia yra beje pliusas, kai ne live video darai, tiesiog actually pasirašai skriptą ir tada darai video, kai tu labai nuosekliai gali išdėstyti viską, nepamiršti nieko ir artikuliuoti ir iškalbėti vietas, kur tiesiog pamiršti, apie ką kalbėti norėjai. Ne tas pats, kas vyksta, kai live darai viską.
Of their underlying shareholders. This is doubly so for Vanguard, who itself is actually owned by its fund holders. In other words, if you bought part of a Vanguard fund, congratulations, you're one of the puppeteers. Now, some have argued that the pursuit of ESG does violate this fiduciary duty since it's considering something outside of financial returns, but ESG variables are often being considered from a risk standpoint, with the idea being that companies with, say, high pollution will eventually face pressures from either high regulatory costs or social backlash if they don't improve their operations. If you're arguing that it's a risk to not consider these variables, it's really hard to demonstrate a violation here. And if the underlying investors who those rights to vote belong to don't like how BlackRock is managing with their money and that voting power, they can, in many circumstances, obviously switch to another asset manager. Yes, there are instances where investors are using 401ks and pension plans, which might be administered by these institutions, in which case the participants don't really get a choice in who to switch between. But plan administrators do have that choice if they believe fiduciary duty is being violated here. And all this is on top of the fact that, according to a lot of papers and surveys on the topic, a lot of people want ESG considerations. According to a 2022 study by asset management firm Capital Group, 89% of institutional and wholesale investors consider ESG issues in some form as part of their investment approach, and a survey by Global Scan found 82% of investors say they're interested.
Aš kaip suprantu, tas ESG yra patapęs irgi dabar kaip dar vienas toks boogeymanas vos ne, kad leftistai su savo tą woke agenda, žaliaja ir panašiai. O realiai, jeigu tu žmogaus paklausi, gerai, žiūrėk, tavo pinigus investuoja, ne? Ar tu norėtum į kokią kryptį, kad atsižvelgtų į žalią energiją, ar tiesiog teršim viską, ką galim ir vapšė pochai mums. Nu, ne į žalią energiją, bet į tas ekologinius dalykus. Nu, didžioji dauguma žmonių pasakys, nu, norėčiau, kad atsižvelgtų. Nenorėčiau, kažkokia dalis pasakys, ne, man pochai vapšė, investuokit, svarbu, man didžiausia profitą įmanoma. Didžioji dauguma, ką čia realiai pasakoja, kad nori, kad atsižvelgtų kažkiek, kad būtų bent jau atsakingi iš tos pusės. Ir tada tie pasaulį kontroliuojantis BlackRocko, galvos tos bordo nariai, kurie tada balsuoja ir kontroliuoja pasaulį, jie atsakingi, jie taip ir turi atsižvelgti. Ir tada juos kaltina, kai jie valdo pasaulį, žinai. Nes taigi, valdžia valdo pasaulio, valdžia čia stumia tavo propagandą ir ESG yra vienas iš tų dalykų. Ir jie taip susieja viską visiškai nelogiškai, jų galvose logiškai susieja, kad čia dar viena sąmokslo teorija ir BlackRockas valdo pasaulį. O kai tu realiai nereikia net daug laiko, 20 minučių paskaitai ir tu realiai matai, kad vapšė netaip veikia netgi ir, kad net nelogiška. Pagalvoju, kaip tu galėtum tiesiog tiek daug žmonių pinigų išmesti balą, jeigu tie žmonės, nenorėtų, nieks pas tave pinigų nelaikytų, tai nesąmonė net. Pažymėjau, darbovietė moka 3 pensijų pakopą darbuotojams, su sąlyga, jog pensijų fondas bus atsinaujinančios energetikos. Kas įdomus matymas?
In investing in companies that are socially and environmentally responsible, while 78% consider or actually invest with ESG in mind, figures that have actually increased over time. And while people are concerned about the potential abuse of power of BlackRock, say voting out directors who don't conform to their strict ESG agenda, that's not really what we've seen play out. BlackRock and Vanguard's support for ESG initiatives has actually plummeted recently. In 2021, it supported nearly half of global shareholder ESG initiatives, but last year that percentage dropped to 22%. And has now fallen to 7% in the last 12 months, with BlackRock saying that a lot of these proposals were overreaching, lacking economic merit, or simply redundant. And it feels really weird to argue, don't worry guys, these asset managers do only care about returns. They don't care about other stakeholders as you feared. But it's pretty clear that the priority for these companies is going to be the return of their investments, even if they do consider some ESG variables. Because at the end of the day, if they don't earn a reasonable return for their investors, they're going to lose them. And
exactly.
That a lot of Larry Fink's statements are more about ESG pandering than they are an ultimate unveiling of his secret agenda. Because if you read any statement from a CEO or executive, even from oil and gas companies, they kind of sound the same, talking about social and environmental responsibility. It's really just a marketing tactic. Anyway, hopefully that helps to paint a full picture. Again, it's not to say that 5 to 10% vote on a given large publicly traded stock does not have an impact and that it doesn't matter. And I actually think there could be arguments again for breaking these companies up. I generally favor competition, and I think we could see more problems if these companies continue to grow larger and larger. But we're really not at the point where BlackRock or Vanguard have the executives of Apple or whatever company in their back pocket when there's another 80 to 90% of shareholders who obviously have their own interests in mind. There are other concerns around BlackRock's ESG ratings and how they can be used to influence other asset managers, including through their Aladdin platform, and the risk of collusion between these asset managers, which would obviously pose a problem. But it's hard to address these without any real evidence. Substantial claims require substantial evidence, and while I wouldn't put it past a large financial institution to abuse its position of power, the most evidence we have here are some marketing pieces by Larry Fink and BlackRock helping to elect some ESG-focused directors that were nominated by an external hedge fund. Anyway, that's a video. Hopefully things were laid out better than with the short I put out. If you like this video, please do make sure to like, subscribe, all that good stuff. It does help the channel tremendously, and let me know your thoughts down below. Like I said...
Okay. Aš nežinau, mano pozicija dabar 100 kartų tiesiog stipresnė, nes viskas, ką aš vakar realiai ginčiau, jo, identiškai praškai, ką aš sakiau, tik sakau, aš biškai gal ne tai žodžiai sakiau, gal dėl to ginčai ir buvo, nes aš net nežinau tiek detalių, bet čia visiškai neįmanoma pasiginčyti, man atrodo, okei. Koks vakaras ilgas, kaip širdį man